You think you know beer. You've been drinking it for years, giving advice about it, judging other people's choices at the bar. Every single thing you're about to hear will make that confidence feel deeply, personally embarrassing. 1. You've been confidently repeating for years that dark beer equals strong beer, that ordering a stout means you're getting wrecked, while a pale lager is basically sparkling water with ambition, and this belief is so wrong it almost deserves its own apology tour. Color in beer comes entirely from roasted malts, grain that's been kilned at high heat until it darkens, the same way coffee beans darken in a roaster. The longer the roast, the darker the beer. Alcohol content, however, is determined by fermentable sugar concentration and yeast activity, a completely separate biological and chemical process that has nothing to do with what color the malt turned. Guinness Draught, the globally iconic symbol of dark, heavy, serious beer, clocks in at approximately 4.2% ABV. That is weaker than most standard lagers, sitting clear and golden in your refrigerator right now. Meanwhile, a pale, golden Belgian triple can reach 9 or 10% ABV and looks like apple juice in a fancy glass. You would never guess it could disassemble your entire evening from the outside. The confusion persists because dark beer has a heavier mouthfeel and roasted flavors that your brain interprets as more. A sensory illusion your body confuses for chemistry. Brewers control darkness and strength using entirely different variables. They can produce a near black session ale at 3.5% or a straw-colored barley wine at 12. Judging beer strength by color is like judging a book's word count by its cover design. You have been measuring the wrong variable with the wrong tool and calling it expertise. 2. The operating assumption in most social circles is that beer must be served as cold as physically possible, that frost on the glass is a mark of quality and respect, and that anything approaching room temperature is an insult to the craft and to the guest. What you've actually been doing with that philosophy is paying for complexity and then refrigerating it into silence. Cold suppresses volatile aromatic compounds. The hops, malts, esters, and yeast-derived flavors that brewers spent weeks carefully developing become chemically muted below roughly 4 degrees Celsius. Every interesting molecule in that beer is still there. Your refrigerator just convinced it to stay quiet. Different styles have internationally recognized ideal serving temperatures that exist because of physics, not snobbery. Pale lagers sit best at 3 to 5 degrees. IPAs open up at 7 to 10. Amber ales at 10 to 13. Belgian strong ales and barley wines at 13 to 16 degrees. These ranges aren't arbitrary preferences from insufferable people at bottle share events. They're flavor delivery specifications. The Serve It Freezing marketing campaign was pioneered aggressively by mass-market lager brands in the mid-20th century for one specific reason. Their products had very little flavor complexity to offer at any temperature, and cold was a feature because the beer wasn't. Enzymes in your taste buds also operate less efficiently at very low temperatures, meaning extreme cold physically reduces your ability to taste anything subtle. A well-made cask ale served at cellar temperature reveals layers the same beer served near frozen will never show. Demanding every beer be served as cold as possible is like insisting every piece of music be played at maximum volume. You haven't improved the experience. You've eliminated nuance and called it preference. 3. The skunky beer story you've been telling your entire adult life goes like this. It got warm. It got ruined. Temperature is the enemy. Never leave beer in a hot car. This story has the wrong villain, the wrong crime scene, and the wrong mechanism, and it has been wrong this entire time. Heat alone does not cause skunking. Light does. Specifically, ultraviolet and visible blue spectrum light. Temperature is almost entirely innocent of the charge you've been filing against it for decades. Skunking, the scientific term is light struck, occurs when UV or high-energy visible light reacts with iso-alpha acids derived from hops. This photochemical reaction produces a compound called 3-methyl-2-butane, 1-thiol, which is structurally almost identical to the defensive chemical a skunk actually sprays. It takes only a few minutes of direct sunlight exposure through the wrong glass to ruin a bottle completely. This is precisely why quality beer comes in brown bottles. Brown glass blocks the damaging light spectrum most effectively. Green glass blocks very little of it. Clear glass blocks essentially none. In a controlled experiment, identical beer exposed to sunlight for 60 seconds in a clear bottle becomes detectably light-struck. The same beer kept in total darkness at room temperature for weeks does not skunk. Warming and then recooling beer does not cause this reaction. The temperature cycling claim has been tested repeatedly and largely debunked for the skunking mechanism specifically. Canned beer has zero light-struck risk because aluminum is completely opaque, which is why many premium craft breweries now package exclusively in cans. You've been blaming warmth for a crime committed entirely by sunlight, and you had the wrong suspect in custody the whole time. 4. The belief that dark beer is heavy, filling, and calorie-dense, that you can't drink many because they sit in your stomach like a meal, is a feeling your brain manufactured from visual information and textural sensation, and it has almost nothing to do with what's actually happening calorically. Guinness Draught contains approximately 125 calories per pint. That is fewer calories than a glass of orange juice. It is fewer calories than most standard lagers. It is significantly fewer than premium IPAs, packed with residual sugars and elevated alcohol content. Calories in beer come primarily from alcohol content and unfermented residual sugars, not from color. A roasted malt contributes the dark appearance and coffee-like flavor notes, but adds relatively few additional calories to the final product. The full sensation most people associate with dark beer comes largely from nitrogen carbonation, which is used in stouts to create smaller, creamier bubbles and a thicker mouthfeel that your brain processes as physical weight. It is a textural trick, not a metabolic event. Research on perceived satiety consistently shows that expectation dramatically influences how full people feel after consuming food or drink. If you sit down believing a dark beer is filling, your brain will enthusiastically cooperate and produce exactly that sensation. Some of the highest calorie beers on the market are pale. Double IPAs and wheat wines routinely exceed 300 to 400 calories per pint. You've been tricked by color and foam into believing you consumed a meal. Your stomach wasn't full. Your assumptions were doing all the work. 5. The confident dismissal of craft beer as an overpriced marketing scam, a performance for people who want to feel sophisticated without actually knowing anything, misses something important. The production costs, ingredient quality, batch scale, and flavor complexity of craft beer are genuinely and measurably different from industrial alternatives, and the price differential usually reflects reality rather than theater. Large industrial breweries operate at enormous economies of scale and frequently use adjuncts like rice and corn to reduce cost and lighten both the flavor and the production expense. Craft brewers typically use 100% malted barley and source specialty hops that cost 5 to 10 times more per pound than commodity varieties. Small batch brewing requires proportionally higher labor costs per unit, more expensive equipment relative to output, and far less distribution leverage to negotiate pricing. The craft beer movement formalized quality standards that directly challenged industrially produced beer's dominance, and the 1978 federal legalization of homebrewing in the United States directly seeded what became thousands of breweries focused on ingredient-forward recipes. Blind taste tests with experienced drinkers repeatedly demonstrate distinguishable differences in flavor complexity, hop character, and malt depth between craft and mass-market alternatives. Beer is also an enormously broad category. Dismissing all craft variation as pretension is like dismissing any meal above a certain price as theatrical simply because cheaper food exists. Scale and sourcing are doing real, verifiable work on both ends of the price spectrum. Calling craft beer overpriced because it costs more than industrial lager is like calling a chef-prepared meal a scam because a frozen dinner exists. 6. The rhyme has governed pre-evening strategy for generations. Beer before liquor, never been sicker. Liquor before beer, you're in the clear. And it is memorable, rhythmically satisfying, and medically fictional in every meaningful sense. Your body metabolizes ethanol as ethanol. It does not recognize, track, or respond differently to the sequence in which different alcohol sources arrived in your stomach. The liver's enzymatic processes have no filing system organized by beverage type and no awareness whatsoever that you switched categories at 10 o'clock. A 2019 study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition specifically tested this mythology with controlled participant groups. Hangover severity showed no statistically significant difference based on drink order. Total alcohol consumption was the only variable that meaningfully predicted outcome. The rhyme likely persists because it contains a small grain of accidental behavioral logic. People who switch from beer to spirits often accelerate their overall intake rate without registering the change, consuming more total alcohol than they intended. The order didn't cause the hangover. The escalation in consumption rate did, and blaming the sequence is a very convenient way to avoid accounting for the volume. Carbonation in beer may slightly accelerate alcohol absorption by influencing gastric emptying, a real but modest physiological effect. And this is entirely unrelated to the mythology's supposed mechanism. What reliably predicts hangover severity is total alcohol consumed, hydration level, sleep quality, individual metabolism, and whether you ate anything substantial. You've been optimizing a sequence your body cannot even read. Your liver only knows how much, and it has never once cared what came first. 7. Beer feels like a modern product. Something that evolved alongside pubs, industrialization, refrigeration, and the concept of the weekend. And placing it anywhere near the ancient world takes a specific mental adjustment that the mythology has made unnecessary because nobody ever told you it was necessary. Beer is arguably one of the oldest deliberately manufactured beverages in human history, predating written language and possibly connected to the very development of early agriculture. The oldest confirmed chemical evidence of beer production dates to approximately 13,000 years ago, discovered at Rakafet Cave in present-day Israel, where residue from fermented grain was found in stone mortars used by the Natufian people. Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets from around 1800 BCE contain the hymn to Ninkasi, a poem to the Sumerian goddess of beer that simultaneously functions as a detailed brewing recipe, one of the oldest written recipes of any kind anywhere in recorded human history. Some archaeologists have proposed that the desire to produce grain specifically for fermentation, not just for bread, may have been a partial driver of early agricultural settlement. Ancient Egyptian pyramid workers were paid partly in beer rations of approximately 4 to 5 liters per day, used as a caloric supplement and a practical nutritional source. Medieval European monasteries maintained sophisticated brewing operations because fermented beer was demonstrably safer as a daily beverage than contaminated local water supplies. Beer didn't show up to keep you company on Friday evenings. Beer was here before your civilization decided to start writing things down, and you are the newcomer in this relationship. 8. The imported beer premium has a seductive logic. A foreign label, a European city name, a bottle with an unfamiliar font. These feel like quality signals. Domestic beer is for people who haven't learned better yet. The inconvenient reality is that imported beer frequently arrives in demonstrably worse condition than comparable domestic beer because of the one variable that matters most for what you're actually tasting: time. Beer is a perishable product. Hops oxidize and develop cardboard-like off flavors. Carbonation fluctuates. Light exposure compounds. Every week between the brewery and your glass is another week of degradation the label doesn't mention. A beer brewed in Europe and shipped to another continent may spend 6 to 12 weeks in transit, warehousing, and distribution, often without rigorous cold chain temperature management at every stage. A locally brewed equivalent was produced weeks ago and traveled a fraction of the distance. The premium European lagers that became symbols of sophistication in export markets, many of them in green glass, as already established, offer virtually no UV protection during that long, warm, inconsistently managed journey. The 1980s and 1990s marketing campaigns that positioned these lagers as premium products in new markets were largely image-based operations. European implied sophistication. The actual liquid inside was not subject to independent quality auditing in the destination market. Top-ranked beers in international competitions consistently include domestic breweries from countries with strong craft scenes. Country of origin is not a quality metric. You're paying a premium for a beer that had a long, stressful, thermally inconsistent journey to reach you, and freshness doesn't upgrade itself during shipping. 9. The foam head on a beer is treated as a primary indicator of quality. Thick, persistent, and white means the brewery did well, the bartender did well, and you made a good choice. No head means something went wrong somewhere in the chain. This is the wrong measurement being applied to the wrong subject. Foam quality is determined primarily by serving conditions, glassware cleanliness, and carbonation level, not by the inherent quality of the beer sitting beneath it. Foam forms when carbon dioxide comes out of solution and interacts with proteins and hop compounds in the beer. Any lipid film from any oily residue, a fingerprint, soap residue from improperly rinsed glassware, a trace of lip balm on the rim, will collapse a foam head almost instantly by breaking the surface tension the foam depends on. A perfectly crafted beer served in a glass with any grease residue will produce little to no foam regardless of quality, which is why serious commercial operations run specific glass washing protocols with beer clean detergent and air drying rather than towel drying. Lager-style beers with moderate carbonation often produce beautiful, persistent heads because of their protein and CO2 profile, not because they are necessarily more complex or more carefully made. Cask ales and many Belgian styles served at cellar temperature with specific conditioning produce, minimal foam entirely by design. A low foam pour of a premium cask ale is correct, not inferior. You've been evaluating a beverage by its bubbles, rating the restaurant by the breadbasket before you've tasted a single thing on the menu. 10. Beer gets blamed for that specific, round abdominal fat deposit with a directness that no other food or beverage achieves. It's literally named after itself, the beer belly, as if the connection were so obvious it required no further investigation. A 2009 review published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition analyzed multiple studies on beer consumption and abdominal obesity and found the results to be deeply inconsistent. Several studies showed correlation. Many did not. When total caloric intake was controlled as a variable, beer showed no special independent relationship to abdominal fat accumulation. Abdominal fat distribution is heavily influenced by sex hormones, genetics, cortisol levels, sleep quality, and overall dietary patterns. Many people with significant abdominal fat do not drink at all, and many people who drink regularly do not accumulate it in that specific pattern. The calories in beer are real and contribute to total energy surplus if intake exceeds expenditure, but so does every other food and beverage consumed in excess. Beer is not metabolically unique in this regard. The association between beer drinking and belly size in population studies is likely confounded by associated behaviors. Beer is commonly consumed alongside high-calorie snack foods, in sedentary social settings, late in the evening. Alcohol does suppress fat oxidation temporarily, while it is being metabolized, meaning the body pauses fat burning during alcohol processing. But this affects fat stored anywhere in the body, not specifically or preferentially in the abdomen. Beer didn't target your midsection with a precision strike. Excess calories did what they always do, and beer just happened to be standing nearby, when people started assigning blame. 11. The green bottle functions as a status symbol in ways that have nothing to do with material science, and everything to do with decades of expertly managed branding. The color signals a certain European quality, a certain price bracket, a certain type of drinker. And none of that has any relationship to how well the bottle actually does its one measurable job. Brown glass filters out the UV and visible light wavelengths, specifically those between 400 and 500 nanometers, that trigger the photochemical skunking reaction detailed earlier. Green glass filters very little of this spectrum. Clear glass filters essentially none. The reason many European lagers moved to green bottles after World War II was straightforwardly practical. Brown glass was in short supply due to wartime material allocation. Breweries used whatever glass was available, and green was available. They retained it afterward because their branding had already been built around that color by the time supply chains normalized. When those same lagers were positioned as premium imports in new markets throughout the following decades, the green bottle traveled with the brand identity, and consumers in those markets interpreted foreign-looking bottle as higher quality because they had no reason to think otherwise. The fact that many iconic premium-positioned green-bottled lagers arrived detectably light-struck in markets far from their source brewery, a genuine, measurable quality flaw, is an irony the industry has quietly absorbed and never addressed publicly. Several brands have shifted to darker glass or aluminum for export markets, specifically because of this problem. You've been paying extra for packaging. That is, by the physics of light, objectively worse at its only real job. 12. The snobbery around canned beer has a straightforward internal logic. Cans are for cheap beer, bottles are for serious beer. And any craft brewer packaging their product in aluminum is either compromising quality for convenience or targeting a customer who doesn't know the difference. The material science disagrees with this position completely and has been disagreeing with it for long enough that the excuse of ignorance is running out. Aluminum cans are 100% opaque, eliminating all light exposure, the primary cause of skunking, at every stage from packaging to your hand. No ultraviolet light, no visible spectrum, no problem at any point in the journey. Cans also provide a superior oxygen barrier compared to bottles. Oxygen is beer's second primary enemy after light, causing oxidation and the stale, cardboard-adjacent flavor that develops in poorly sealed or aging product. Modern conceaming technology creates an extremely tight seal that outperforms most bottle cap applications. The persistent metallic taste from cans complaint is largely psychosomatic. Modern cans have a polymer lining that prevents beer from ever contacting the aluminum directly, and blind taste tests consistently showed drinkers cannot reliably distinguish canned from bottled versions of the same product. Cans are also lighter, cheaper to ship per unit, cool faster in ice, and can go places glass cannot. Stadiums, pools, hiking trails, outdoor events. Many of the world's highest-rated craft breweries package exclusively or primarily in cans. The format has been fully rehabilitated among serious producers. You've been dismissing the superior container because it reminds you of something cheap. That's not a quality judgment. It's a class association wearing a lab coat. 13. The cultural consensus in certain beer enthusiast spaces is that higher alcohol content means more flavor, more reward, more craft. That imperial everything represents the ceiling of what brewing can achieve, and that session-strength beer is for people who haven't graduated yet. Alcohol is one ingredient contributing to flavor and body in beer. It is neither the primary driver of complexity nor automatically an improvement once it exceeds certain levels. Ethanol contributes warmth, some sweetness, and a sense of body to the overall experience. Excessive alcohol creates harsh, burning, hot sensations that actively mask subtler flavors rather than enhancing or revealing them. Session beers, typically defined as under 4.5% ABV, are specifically engineered to deliver flavor complexity without the numbing heat of high alcohol, and maintaining genuine hop and malt character at low alcohol concentration is technically more demanding than producing a heavily boosted imperial version where the alcohol provides body and intensity by default. The phenomenon of ABV creep in craft beer, where producers competed to push strength higher and higher through a specific period, generated some genuinely unbalanced, unpleasant beers alongside the exceptional ones. Some of the most technically celebrated styles in the world, including Berliner Weisse, Gose, and classic Czech Pilsner, traditionally sit at 3 to 5% ABV and are not considered lesser for it by anyone who knows what they're evaluating. In formal judging, a beer that tastes too alcoholic, too hot, is marked down as unbalanced. Judging quality by ABV is like judging cooking by salt content. At some point, you're not enhancing anything. You're just overpowering it and calling it bold. 14. The idea that beer is inherently, historically, and culturally a masculine product. That women are the wine list and men are the tap handles. That this division reflects something natural rather than something manufactured, is historically inverted in a way that the marketing of the last century made almost completely invisible. Women were the primary brewers of beer for most of human history. In ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian cultures, brewing was women's work, connected to bread making and household food production as part of a unified grain management role. The Sumerian goddess of brewing, Ninkasi, was female, worshipped by the culture that produced some of the oldest written brewing records in existence. In medieval Europe, alewives, women who brewed and sold ale commercially, were a central economic class with established trade practices. They displayed a broomstick outside their premises to signal fresh ale for sale, a trade sign that many historians believe contributed to the broomstick riding witch image as a cultural reframing of an independent, economically active woman who operated outside male guild structures. The industrialization of brewing in the 19th century moved production from homes and small operations to factories, simultaneously professionalizing the trade and masculinizing the workforce along the same lines as every other industry that transitioned to factory production. 20th century beer marketing then explicitly and aggressively targeted male consumers, cementing a demographic association that was manufactured rather than organic. Contemporary data shows women representing a rapidly growing segment of craft beer consumers and a significant portion of professional brewers, judges, and writers globally. The masculine branding is recent, deliberate, and built on a foundation it spent a century pretending didn't exist. 15. The fear around homebrewing. That it's dangerous, that people go blind from it, that you could poison yourself or your guests, that it should be left to professionals, applies the safety concerns of an entirely different process to an activity with a genuinely benign safety record. The blindness risk that haunts homebrewing's reputation belongs to distillation, not to brewing. Methanol, the compound responsible for blindness and death in contaminated illegal spirits, is a byproduct of the distillation process when operators fail to properly separate the early fraction of a distillate. Brewing, the fermentation of grain without any distillation step, produces only trace methanol levels that are biologically inconsequential by any standard of measurement. The human body produces and safely metabolizes small amounts of methanol continuously from eating ordinary fruits and vegetables. The trace levels in homebrew beer are comparable to or lower than what your body already processes daily from food. The worst realistic outcomes from poorly executed homebrewing are bad flavor, off aromas, excessive sourness from bacterial contamination, or explosive carbonation from bottles sealed before fermentation completed, none of which cause physical harm to anyone consuming them. The United States federal government legalized homebrewing for personal consumption in 1978, and the safety record of the hobby over the subsequent decades has been demonstrably benign by any regulatory or public health measure. Homebrewing supply shops operate openly and legally. Professional brewing organizations actively encourage the hobby as a talent pipeline, You've been applying the safety concerns of moonshining to the safety profile of making bread. They share yeast and nothing else that's relevant to this particular fear. 16. Belgium has an extraordinary brewing tradition and produces some of the most remarkable and complex beers made anywhere on Earth. And none of that changes the fact that crowning one country the permanent, singular world capital of brewing achievement distorts the genuine contributions of everyone else who has been doing this for just as long or longer. The Czech Republic holds a legitimate claim to inventing modern lager as the world actually knows and drinks it. Pilsner was developed in the city of Plzeň in 1842 when Bavarian brewer Josef Groll produced the first pale, golden, cold-fermented lager using local soft water and Saaz hops. This style now accounts for the overwhelming majority of beer consumed worldwide. By volume, it is the defining beer of the modern era, originating in Bohemia, not Belgium. Germany's brewing traditions. The Reinheitsgebot, formalized in 1516. The wheat beer lineages. The Bock family. The seasonal Märzen. Represent distinct and historically significant brewing cultures developed over centuries under exacting standards. England developed porter and stout as the world's first truly industrial beer styles in the 18th century, styles that now form the backbone of entire modern categories. The American craft revolution since the 1980s produced hop varieties, IPA formats, and experimental adjunct approaches that are now globally influential and widely imitated. Belgium's genuine contributions, Trappist ales, lambics, saison, gueuze, are extraordinary and deserve immense respect. They simply do not constitute the entirety of brewing achievement. Crowning one country the permanent winner of a centuries-old global competition isn't connoisseurship. It's just a strong opinion wearing a beret. 17. The dismissal of beer-specific glassware as an affectation for people with too much shelf space and too little self-awareness misses something that fluid dynamics and sensory science have documented clearly. Glass shape creates measurable, chemically real differences in aroma delivery, foam behavior, carbonation retention, and temperature management that directly affect what you actually taste. A tulip glass concentrates volatile aromatic compounds above the surface and directs them toward your nose as you drink through its inward curving lip, a geometric function that a straight-sided pint glass cannot replicate because it allows aromatics to dissipate laterally into the surrounding room instead. The nucleation points etched into the bases of certain beer glasses create continuous CO2 streams from the liquid to the surface, maintaining carbonation release and providing ongoing aroma agitation throughout the drinking session. Without them, flat zones form and aromatic delivery diminishes faster. Weizen glasses are tall and narrow to accommodate the characteristically large foam heads of wheat beer styles, while keeping your warm hand at a distance from the liquid it would otherwise heat. A 2015 study in the journal Food Quality and Preference demonstrated that drinking vessel shape influences perceived taste, carbonation sensation, and consumption speed in measurable ways. One Belgian Trappist brewery legally tied beer releases to a specific proprietary glass shape, citing scientific documentation that flavor expression was incomplete without it, a position that serious sensory researchers found defensible. The glass is part of the delivery system for everything interesting in the beer. Dismissing it as pretension is like dismissing speakers as furniture and then wondering why the music sounds flat. 18. Beer's reputation as a dehydrating agent has been stated with such confidence and frequency that matching water intake to beer intake has become a social norm, a responsible drinking practice, and an article of near universal belief. The physiology is more complicated than the simple claim deserves. Beer is approximately 90 to 95% water by composition. Even accounting for alcohol's diuretic mechanism, the net fluid intake from moderate beer consumption is positive. You are taking in more water than you are losing through the alcohol-triggered response. Alcohol inhibits vasopressin, the antidiuretic hormone, which increases urine output relative to fluid intake. However, this effect scales directly with alcohol concentration. Weaker beers produce a diuretic response insufficient to overcome their substantial water volume, meaning you come out net hydrated. A 2016 study from Ben Gurion University of the Negev compared post-exercise rehydration using water, isotonic reduced alcohol beer, and regular 5% beer. The isotonic version performed comparably to water. Regular beer showed some deficit, but the difference was moderate rather than dramatic. The catastrophic dehydration narrative around beer applies meaningfully to high ABV consumption sustained over time without food or water supplementation, situations where any significant alcohol intake creates problems regardless of the beverage form. The morning after dry mouth that gets attributed to beer dehydration is frequently partly caused by acetaldehyde, a metabolic byproduct of alcohol processing, and congeners rather than pure water deficit. Beer is mostly water that's been made interesting. Treating it as antihydration is technically accurate at excess, but misleadingly dramatic at moderate levels. The villain is the alcohol percentage, not the category. 19. The prestige associated with draft beer. The idea that on tap is automatically fresher, superior, and preferable to the same beer from a bottle, or can, assigns quality guarantees to a delivery mechanism that earns them only when the infrastructure behind it is properly maintained, and that infrastructure is frequently not. Draft beer lines accumulate yeast, bacteria, and beer stone, if not cleaned, at recommended intervals, typically every 2 weeks for active lines. A dirty draft line is one of the most common causes of off flavors in commercial bar beer, producing buttery diacetyl notes, vinegar-like acetic acid character, or musty contamination that arrives in your glass with zero warning from the tap itself. Industry surveys have found that a significant percentage of commercial draft lines are not cleaned at recommended frequencies. The fresh draft experience you're paying a premium for may be coming through tubing that hasn't been properly cleaned in months. Kegs can also be improperly stored at wrong temperatures, damaged, or served with incorrect gas mixture ratios. The balance of CO2 to nitrogen affects both carbonation and foam characteristics in ways that alter the experience substantially. A properly stored, fresh-dated bottle or can of the same beer, sealed with no oxygen exposure, kept cold, and consumed within its recommended window, will frequently outperform a draft pour from a poorly maintained system by a measurable margin. Truly excellent draft beer from a meticulously maintained system with proper rotation is exceptional, but draft is a delivery mechanism, not a quality guarantee. You've been trusting the tap more than the tube it runs through has consistently deserved. 20. The hop is celebrated as the defining ingredient of beer, the star of the menu at most craft establishments, the subject of endless variety discussion. The molecule that beer culture has decided represents what the drink fundamentally is. This is a historically recent consensus built on a commercially motivated transition that displaced a much older and more varied tradition. Hops became the dominant bittering agent in European brewing between the 13th and 16th centuries, replacing a group of botanicals collectively called gruit, a regional mix that varied by location and brewer and included yarrow, mugwort, bog myrtle, juniper, and other herbs and spices. The transition to hops was partly flavor-driven, but significantly shaped by economic and political forces. Hop merchants and territories with hop-growing privileges lobbied actively for regulations that mandated hops in brewing, displacing gruit producers who operated under different guild structures and different tax arrangements. The Reinheitsgebot of 1516 mandated hops specifically, partly for quality control standardization, and partly to establish a taxable, regulatable ingredient list that was easier to govern. Many modern heritage breweries now produce gruit ales using pre-hop botanical combinations, demonstrating that beer without hops is not a novelty, but an ancient and legitimate product category. Malt is arguably the more foundational beer ingredient. It provides the fermentable sugars from which alcohol derives, the color, the body, and much of the flavor base. Without malt, you have water. Without hops, you have the beer humans were drinking for most of recorded history. Hops arrived roughly 1,000 years after beer arrived in civilization and convinced everyone it was always in charge. 21. The rule against temperature cycling. Once cold, must stay cold. Warming and rechilling destroys the beer. Treat it like a patient on a critical medication schedule. Is presented as ironclad beer storage doctrine and is, for most commercially produced beer, substantially overstated. The temperature cycling concern is real and specific. It applies to unpasteurized, unfiltered beer containing live yeast. Live yeast is metabolically sensitive to temperature fluctuation and can produce off flavors when stressed by repeated thermal changes. This is a genuine issue for a specific category of product. Most commercially produced beer, however, including the majority of craft brands, is either pasteurized, which heat treats the product to eliminate microbiological activity, or sterile filtered before packaging. For these beers, the yeast is absent from the final product, and temperature cycling affects only physical properties. What cyclical temperature change can legitimately do is slightly accelerate oxidation chemistry in some beers and cause cosmetic haze formation as proteins crash out of solution and then redissolve. These effects are real, but usually minor and often imperceptible without comparative tasting. The primary drivers of meaningful beer deterioration are time, sustained heat rather than cyclical heat, light exposure, and oxygen ingress, not moderate temperature variation from a normal supply chain or a day in a bag. Cold chain marketing by distributors and retailers often overstates mandatory continuous refrigeration because keeping beer cold increases shelf appeal and reduces return rates. Your beer didn't break because it spent a warm afternoon in transit. You've been applying power plant safety protocols to a grain beverage with considerably more resilience than the marketing suggests. 22. Beer gets seated at the casual dining table, and wine gets the fine dining reservation. And this division is presented as a matter of inherent quality and culinary seriousness rather than what it actually is. A class convention that arrived before the evidence did and has been protected by the dining industry ever since. Beer has a broader flavor range, wider stylistic diversity, and in many cases, better food pairing versatility than wine. A case made by serious chefs and credentialed sommeliers, not just advocates from the beer side of the argument. Beer's carbonation physically cuts through fat and cleanses the palate between bites in a way wine cannot replicate. This is a functional, mechanical advantage that makes beer particularly effective alongside fatty, rich dishes where wine can feel cumulative and heavy. The flavor range across beer styles, from the bone-dry acidic sourness of a lambic to the roasted bitterness of an imperial stout to the tropical, resinous character of a modern IPA, offers pairing options that exceed most wine categories in breadth by an objective count of distinct flavor profiles. Michelin-starred restaurants in Belgium, Scandinavia, and increasingly the United States have introduced formal beer pairing menus alongside, or in some cases replacing wine programs entirely. The Culinary Institute of America has taught beer pairing as a serious discipline since the early 2000s. Cicerone certification, beer's professional equivalent of the sommelier qualification, is now recognized as a genuine industry credential. Beer got kicked off the fine dining table by social convention, not by flavor failure. The wine list isn't there because wine is objectively superior for food. Wine got to the maitre d' first. 23. Fruit beers are treated as novelty products for people who don't actually enjoy beer. A compromise category. A disguise for the hop bitterness that the uncommitted drinker can't handle. Something that doesn't belong in a serious conversation about craft. This position requires ignoring centuries of revered tradition from some of the most respected breweries in the world. Belgian lambic ales, among the most complex and technically demanding beers produced anywhere by any measure, are traditionally refermented with whole fresh fruit as a central step in the production process. Kriek, made with sour cherries, and Framboise, made with raspberries, are ancient styles that predate the modern craft beer era by hundreds of years. Cantillon, one of the world's most sought-after and critically respected breweries, produces fruit re-fermented lambics that appear regularly on top-rated beer lists globally. These are not novelty products. They are benchmark beers that require years of production knowledge and wild fermentation expertise to execute correctly. The traditional fruit addition in lambic brewing is not flavoring in the modern commercial sense. It provides additional fermentable sugars for wild yeast and bacteria to consume, triggering secondary fermentation that builds complexity over months of conditioning. The modern fruit beer category that generated the snobbery, artificially sweetened, aggressively flavored light beer with fruit extract, is a genuinely separate product that should be evaluated on its own terms. Dismissing fruit beer is dismissing centuries of sophisticated fermentation tradition, because someone once put fake strawberry flavoring in something and called it beer. The original deserves better than guilt by association. 24. Lager is the starting point, the lowest common denominator, the beer you drink before you know better, the mass production product that defines everything the craft movement positioned itself against. The problem with this consensus is that it confuses the industrial execution of a style with the style itself, and in doing so, writes off some of the most technically demanding brewing in the world as beginner material. Lager ferments at cold temperatures using bottom fermenting yeast strains, typically at 7 to 13 degrees Celsius, then undergoes extended cold conditioning for weeks or months. This process produces the clean, crisp character the style is known for, and any ingredient flaw is fully exposed in the final product, because there is nowhere to hide it behind assertive hop bitterness or roasted malt intensity. A traditional Czech Pilsner, properly produced and served unpasteurized from a freshly rotated keg within weeks of production, is considered by serious evaluators to be one of the most sublime beer experiences in the world. German Helles, Märzen, Rauchbier, and Doppelbock are all lager styles of considerable complexity and historical importance, produced by breweries operating under exacting traditional standards. The dominance of low-quality mass-market lagers is a function of industrial production economics and profit optimization, not an inherent quality ceiling of the style or its techniques. Craft brewers frequently cite well-made lager as one of the hardest styles to execute correctly, far harder than producing a heavily hopped IPA where bitterness and hop aromatics provide generous cover for minor process flaws. You dismissed lager because mass production made it boring, and in doing so, you missed some of the world's most demanding brewing. 25. The Reinheitsgebot, Germany's famous purity law, still invoked as a quality guarantee on beer labels and in marketing copy, carries an authority that its actual origins don't quite support. It is presented as an ancient declaration of brewing philosophy, a quality standard written by wise people who cared deeply about what beer should be. The document's actual motivations were considerably more practical and considerably less idealistic. The 1516 Bavarian Law was primarily motivated by grain economics, specifically reserving wheat and rye for bread production during periods of scarcity when competition between bakers and brewers for the same raw material was a real social problem. It was also about tax regulation, standardizing a short, controllable list of taxable ingredients, and it addressed genuine public health concerns about adulterants, then commonly added to beer by unscrupulous producers. Quality brewing philosophy was a secondary consideration at best. The Reinheitsgebot's restrictive ingredient list also prohibited traditional German styles, including Berliner Weisse and many historically botanical-enhanced beers, forcing them into legal gray zones or practical elimination for centuries, an outcome that does not read as a triumph of quality protection. Modern German brewing operates under the Biergesetz, a more contemporary legal framework, not the literal 1516 text, which has been progressively revised through history. The law's export marketing value has been enormous. It implies ancient wisdom and rigorous purity standards while functioning partly as very old and very effective branding. Respecting German brewing tradition is entirely warranted. Assuming the law is what creates the quality is reading the marketing brochure as if it were the lab report. 26. The narrative around beer and bone health is almost always presented as a simple harm story. Alcohol leaches calcium. Beer is full of empty calories. The combination is bad for bone density, and anyone who cares about their skeleton should look elsewhere. What this narrative consistently omits is that beer is one of the most significant dietary sources of orthosilicic acid, the bioavailable form of silicon, which is one of the key minerals associated with bone mineral density in human subjects. Silicon plays a role in bone matrix formation and collagen synthesis, and beer delivers it in a form the human body absorbs more readily than most dietary sources. A 2009 study published in the Journal of the Science of Food and Agriculture analyzed the silicon content across a range of commercial beers and found that ales and IPAs, due to their higher malt and hop content, contain the highest concentrations. Multiple population studies have found that moderate beer consumption, defined in most research as 1 to 2 drinks per day, correlates with higher bone mineral density compared to abstinence, particularly in older men. This association is not fully understood mechanistically, but silicon content is a plausible and actively studied contributing factor. Excessive alcohol consumption does negatively affect bone formation and increases fracture risk. But this applies to all alcohol at high doses, not beer specifically, and not at moderate intake levels. The dietary silicon angle is genuinely understudied in mainstream nutrition discussion, and the connection is not licensed for therapeutic drinking. It does, however, make the simple harm narrative importantly incomplete, which in nutrition is essentially a permanent condition. 27. The shorthand for IPA among people who have never really explored the category is bitterness. Face-puckering, palate-assaulting, incomprehensible bitterness that only people who've developed a specific tolerance can navigate. If you like IPA, you like bitterness. That's the whole product on offer. The IPA category is now one of the most internally diverse groupings in world brewing, and the styles it contains share a category name and sometimes a yeast and very little else. West Coast IPA, the style that drove the modern IPA resurgence, is dry, resinous, piney, and aggressively bitter by design. Bitterness is the intended feature and the selling point. New England IPA, also called hazy IPA, is deliberately low in bitterness, hazy in appearance, and saturated with tropical and citrus hop aromatics achieved through late and dry hopping. It is frequently described as drinking fruit juice. The bitterness is actively suppressed, not featured. Session IPA runs under 4.5% ABV, delivers hop aromatics with a lighter body, and is designed for sustained consumption without significant alcohol load. Imperial or Double IPA runs 8 to 10% or higher, with a massive malt backbone supporting enormous hop character that is as much about sweet richness as bitterness. Black IPA, Brut IPA, bone dry and champagne-like, and Milkshake IPA, lactose-sweetened and often heavily fruit-laden, expand the category further into territory that tastes nothing like what most people mean when they say IPA. Saying IPA just tastes bitter is like saying music is just drums. Technically accurate for some examples. A catastrophic undercount of everything else in the catalog. 28. Warm beer is flat beer. This is stated as established fact in casual conversation worldwide, and the logic seems airtight. Cold equals carbonation. Warm equals still and sad and wrong. The temperature-carbonation relationship is real, but the conclusion you've drawn from it is not. Carbon dioxide solubility in liquid decreases as temperature increases, which means warmer beer releases CO2 from solution faster and may feel less carbonated on the palate than the same beer served cold. The CO2 was always present in the beer. It just presents differently at different temperatures, and some of it escapes into the air above the glass rather than releasing on your tongue as you drink. British Real Ale, served at cellar temperature around 10 to 13 degrees Celsius, is produced and served with very low carbonation by deliberate design and by centuries of tradition. This is not a flaw or a failure of refrigeration. It is the correct serving condition for the style, one that allows hop and malt character to express without the interference of aggressive carbonation, masking subtler notes. Many Belgian ales, including several Abbey and Trappist styles, present as low carbonation products at their recommended serving temperatures by similar design intent. A beer that foams violently when warm is releasing dissolved CO2 rapidly, which means the carbonation was always there, just escaping inefficiently into the air rather than being retained in the glass. Carbonation levels are a stylistic variable engineered into the product, not a quality metric imposed from outside it. Warm beer isn't automatically flat. You've been confusing CO2 in the glass with CO2 in the beer, and those are different locations. 29. The lime in a bottle practice is treated by a specific segment of beer culture as an abomination, evidence that the drinker doesn't really like beer, that the brewery is compensating for quality deficiencies, that marketing has successfully dressed up a compromise as a tradition. The functional origin of that lime is more interesting than the dismissal acknowledges. The most commonly lime-garnished beers are served in clear glass bottles, packaging that offers no ultraviolet protection whatsoever throughout the entire distribution and retail journey. Lime juice is acidic and contains ascorbic acid. When squeezed into the bottle, it may slightly delay oxidation of hop compounds and help address light-struck flavors that have already begun developing during that unprotected transit. Whether this was a calculated industry decision or organic consumer behavior that was subsequently encouraged by producers is a genuinely debated question among brewing historians. The flavor modification is chemically functional regardless of its origin. Beyond the lime specifically, mixing citrus and beer has deep cultural roots that predate the bottled lager. Radler combining beer with lemonade or citrus soda is a German tradition with documented origins in the 1920s, developed as a low-alcohol refresher for cyclists. Michelada, combining beer with lime, hot sauce, and spices, is a sophisticated Mexican beverage tradition with deep cultural legitimacy that has nothing to do with masking poor product. The snobbery around lime and beer has been weaponized to gatekeep who is permitted to enjoy a beverage without presenting credentials. The lime isn't destroying the beer. In some cases, it's addressing a problem the clear bottle already created. You're blaming the garnish for the packaging's crime. 30. The assumption that the carbonation in your beer is a natural, organic product of fermentation, CO2 produced by yeast, captured in the vessel, preserved as bubbles until they reach your glass, is a pleasantly romantic image of a process that commercial brewing mostly abandoned in favor of something considerably more industrial. During primary fermentation, yeast produces large volumes of CO2 as it consumes fermentable sugars, and most of that CO2 escapes into the atmosphere through airlocks and pressure relief valves during the active fermentation period. By the time fermentation completes, very little CO2 remains naturally dissolved in the beer at commercially useful levels. Forced carbonation involves placing degassed, fully fermented beer in a sealed vessel and injecting CO2 under controlled pressure at controlled temperature until the desired carbonation level is achieved. The CO2 used in this process is often commercially produced gas, not fermentation captured from that specific batch, sourced from industrial suppliers. This is the standard production method for most kegged, canned, and bottled commercial beer, including the majority of craft brewery output. Forced carbonation is not inferior to natural carbonation. It allows precise, consistent control of dissolved gas levels from batch to batch, which is a genuine quality advantage at commercial scale. Natural conditioning does occur in bottle-conditioned beers, where a small sugar addition triggers secondary fermentation in the sealed bottle. Cask ale conditions similarly in the barrel, but these represent a minority of commercial volume. The bubbles in your beer most likely came from a tank of purchased industrial CO2, and that doesn't make them less bubbly. It just makes the story less romantic than you were imagining. 31. The belief that drinking beer through a straw accelerates intoxication through some physiological shortcut. Reduced oxygen, pressure changes, bypassing something important about normal swallowing mechanics, is one of those myths that sounds like it might have a biological mechanism behind it, right up until you check whether a biological mechanism actually exists. Your body absorbs alcohol primarily in the small intestine and partially in the stomach. The delivery vehicle, straw, glass, bottle, cupped hands, does not change this absorption pathway, does not create any bypass, and does not alter the rate at which your liver can process ethanol. There is no anatomical shortcut created by straw drinking. The idea that drinking from a lower point or using a narrow tube changes stomach pressure dynamics or blood alcohol kinetics in some meaningful way is physiologically unsupported by any research. What is supported is a behavioral observation. People may drink faster through a straw, particularly from a large vessel, without consciously registering the volume being consumed at the same rate they would while lifting a glass to their lips. Faster consumption produces higher peak blood alcohol concentration because the liver's fixed processing rate is overwhelmed by rapid intake. The straw correlated with the intoxication, but correlation wore the wrong label. Carbonated beverages, including beer, may slightly accelerate alcohol absorption in some individuals through carbonation's effect on gastric emptying. This is a documented but modest physiological effect, and it applies to the carbonation, not the straw. The straw doesn't have a chemical relationship with your bloodstream. You got drunk faster because you drank faster, and the straw was an accessory to the timeline, not the mechanism. 32. The saying that beer is liquid bread invites a comfortable equivalence between two products that share a starting point and then diverge into almost entirely different nutritional and chemical territories. Both begin with grain. Both involve yeast fermentation. After that, the analogy becomes increasingly misleading in ways that the phrase has been cheerfully concealing for years. In bread, fermentation produces CO2 that leavens the dough and trace alcohol that evaporates during baking. In beer, fermentation produces alcohol as the primary retained product, and CO2 that either carbonates the beer or is released. Beer contains no significant fiber. The grain solids, called spent grain, are removed during the lautering step of the brewing process, and are sometimes actually used in bread production as an ingredient, which makes the relationship between the two more of a recycling chain than a nutritional parallel. The protein, vitamin, and mineral content of bread, particularly whole grain varieties, is substantially more complete as a food source than beer offers. The medieval and ancient liquid bread narratives referred to specific low-alcohol nutritive beers, produced for caloric supplementation during religious fasting or in contexts of food scarcity, where the comparison had some practical caloric logic. Applying that comparison to a modern 6% IPA and using it to imply nutritional equivalence is an anachronism that the phrase has survived entirely through charm rather than accuracy. Beer and bread are relatives who share a neighborhood and some family resemblance. Claiming full nutritional equivalence based on shared ancestry is like claiming grape juice and wine have the same dietary profile because they both begin with the same fruit. 33. The ABV percentage displayed on your beer label presents itself with the confidence of a precise regulatory measurement. 5.0% means 5.0%, and you can plan your evening's consumption on that number with appropriate accuracy. The legal reality of what that number is required to represent is considerably more permissive than the precision of the formatting implies. In the United States, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau permits an ABV variance of plus or minus 0.3% for beers under 7%, with broader tolerances applying for stronger products depending on the state regulations involved and label type classification. Independent laboratory testing of commercially sold beer has documented the practical consequences of this tolerance. A 2010 analytical study examining 91 beers found that 29% were mislabeled by more than 0.3%, and several products exceeded 1% deviation from their stated alcohol content. Measuring alcohol accurately requires sophisticated analytical equipment, digital density meters, distillation measurement, or gas chromatography. Small breweries typically calculate alcohol content from original and final gravity readings, an indirect method that introduces meaningful measurement error across batches. Session beers labeled as under 4.5% ABV may consistently produce closer to 5% in laboratory analysis. Still session in spirit and character, but not in regulatory precision. The tax structure in many jurisdictions is also organized around alcohol content bans, creating some industry incentive to label at the lower boundary of a legally defensible range. The ABV on your can is an approximation wearing the confidence of a precision measurement. Your evening plan already has a margin of error the label never disclosed. 34. Beer pong carries itself with the cultural authority of an ancient institution. It feels timeless, like something humans always understood about cups and balls and competitive social drinking, like it emerged from some universal shared logic that required no inventor. The game has a specific, traceable, thoroughly undramatic origin that fits in a narrow slice of 20th century American university social history and traveled from there. The game is widely traced to Dartmouth College in the 1950s and 60s, where a game called Pong was played on actual table tennis tables using paddles, far closer to modified table tennis with drinking penalties than to the throw the ball into the cup format that most people know today. The modern throw format, requiring no paddles and using only cups on a table surface, is frequently attributed to Lehigh University in the 1980s, from which it spread through fraternity networks and college social circuits over the following decade. The two formats coexisted regionally for years under different names, with Beirut used in some communities for the throw version and beer pong retained by paddle format adherents who disputed the name transfer. The game's national standardization accelerated dramatically with early internet culture in the 2000s, when rule debates spread online and regional variants converged into rough consensus around a dominant format. Official beer pong tournaments, branded cup sets, replacement ball specifications, and association rulemaking are all products of the last few decades. Artifacts of late 20th and early 21st century American college culture, not inherited tradition. The reverence people carry for its specific rules is tradition measured in decades, not generations, and the origin story is a lot less epic than the confidence around the rules usually implies. 35. Beer gets a supporting role in the kitchen, and not much more. The batter for fried things, the occasional stunt in a recipe that wants to seem interesting. Using beer as a genuine culinary ingredient at any level of seriousness is treated as amateur territory that wine and stock vacated for good reasons. Several centuries of high cuisine disagree with that position in languages other than English. Belgian cuisine integrates beer into fundamental dishes at a national level. Carbonade Flamande, the Flemish beef stew, is traditionally made with dark Belgian ale, typically a double or regional brown ale, and the dish's flavor is structurally dependent on malt character and hop bitterness in ways that make wine substitution produce a genuinely different and lesser result. Beer's carbonation tenderizes protein through the action of carbonic acid on muscle fibers and creates demonstrably lighter batters through CO2 bubble expansion during the frying process. The mechanism behind beer-battered products being texturally distinct from water or wine-battered equivalents. The Maillard reactions and caramelization of malt sugars during braising create complex browned flavors in reduction sauces and cooking liquids that are chemically different from wine-based reductions, not merely analogous. Roasted stouts and porters serve a function in baked goods that mimics espresso's role in chocolate intensification. The slight bitterness and roasted compound interaction amplifies chocolate character in ways that no other liquid ingredient replicates. Top culinary schools and restaurants with serious critical recognition now teach and practice beer-based cooking as a legitimate technique. Beer has been a serious cooking ingredient in serious kitchens for centuries. The batter was never the ceiling. It was just the first room most people entered. 36. The craft beer movement is a late 20th century American phenomenon, born from a specific regulatory moment in 1978, spread by a specific demographic in specific American cities, and exported as a cultural product from there to the rest of the world. What America created is a marketing category, a regulatory definition, and a remarkably effective cultural enthusiasm. The concept of small-scale, ingredient-focused, stylistically diverse brewing is as old as brewing itself and has never stopped existing in multiple parts of the world. Trappist monks in Belgium have brewed small-batch, complex, ingredient-specific ales continuously since the Middle Ages, producing beers under conditions of religious rigor and quality control that predates modern craft certification by centuries. Westvleteren 12, produced at the St. Sixtus Abbey with highly restricted distribution, is regularly cited as one of the greatest beers made anywhere, and has been produced in its current form for generations without a craft beer marketing framework to validate it. British Real Ale Brewing, cask-conditioned, small producer, locality-specific, never fully stopped during the industrial consolidation that American craft beer positioned itself as a reaction against. CAMRA, the Campaign for Real Ale, was founded in 1971 to preserve a tradition that had never disappeared, only contracted. What the American movement genuinely contributed was scale, evangelical energy, and specific innovations. New World hop varieties, IPA format evolution, the hazy beer category, aggressive adjunct experimentation. These are real and significant contributions to global brewing culture. America didn't invent small intentional brewing. America rebranded it, scaled the enthusiasm, and exported the narrative. And that's impressive enough without claiming the entire history. 37. The everyday experience of bitterness in beer. The characteristic that most casual drinkers identify as beer's defining flavor gets attributed to the malt, particularly the roasted, dark malt in heavier beers, because the roasted flavors read as bitter colloquially and the association sticks. The primary source of bitterness in beer is hops, not malt, and malt-derived roast character is a chemically distinct flavor compound that should not be conflated with hop-derived bitterness. Bitterness from hops comes from iso-alpha acids, produced when alpha acids in hop cones are chemically isomerized by heat during the boiling stage of production. International bitterness units measure the concentration of these iso-alpha acids in the finished beer. Malt contributes roasted, coffee-adjacent, and chocolate-like flavors through Maillard reactions that occur during high-heat kilning. Flavors that some drinkers describe as bitter in casual language, but that are produced by entirely different chemical compounds through an entirely different mechanism. A dark roasty stout can carry a relatively modest IBU rating while presenting intense roasted character. A pale IPA can carry extreme IBUs while presenting light, almost neutral malt character. The perception of bitterness is also modulated powerfully by residual sweetness in the finished beer. A high IBU beer with substantial unfermented sugars may taste considerably less bitter than a low IBU beer that is fermented very dry. Different hop varieties also deliver qualitatively different bitterness characters. Some sharp and harsh, others described as smooth, round, or soft, making bitterness not a single dimension, but a complex spectrum. Malt gives you darkness and roast. Hops give you bitterness. The credit has been going to the wrong party the entire time. 38. The chain of reasoning that connects beer to heart damage has a clean, simple logic. Alcohol damages the heart. Beer is alcohol. Therefore, beer damages the heart. The physiology declines to be quite that cooperative. The relationship between moderate beer consumption and cardiovascular health has been examined in a substantial number of large-scale epidemiological studies, and many of them have found a nonlinear relationship, a J-shaped curve, where light to moderate drinkers show lower coronary heart disease risk than both heavy drinkers and complete abstainers. The proposed mechanisms include alcohol's effect on raising HDL cholesterol and reducing platelet aggregation at moderate levels, both of which have cardiovascular relevance. Beer specifically contains polyphenols from malt and hops with antioxidant properties, and is a meaningful dietary source of B vitamins including folate, as well as the silicon relevant to bone health established earlier. Any cardiovascular protective association, if real, appears linked to moderate alcohol consumption in general, rather than beer specifically. Wine receives disproportionate attribution, here largely because of historically better marketing in health-adjacent contexts, not because of unique chemical advantages. Heavy alcohol consumption is unambiguously associated with cardiomyopathy, arrhythmias, and elevated blood pressure. No dispute exists on that end. The discussion is specifically about low to moderate consumption in defined daily quantities. The J-curve's validity continues to be debated methodologically because abstainer populations include former heavy drinkers who stopped due to health problems, inflating apparent risk in the non-drinking category. The relationship between beer and your heart is not a straight line, descending into damage. It curves. The science is complicated, and neither end of the debate deserves your uncritical confidence. 39. Every best before date on a beer is treated as the cliff's edge, the point past which the contents are inferior, suspect, potentially undrinkable, a quality statement about what the brewery has given up on. The reality depends entirely on what style of beer is sitting behind the date, and for a meaningful portion of beer produced, that date marks the beginning of the interesting period rather than its end. Barley wines, imperial stouts, Belgian strong ales, Trappist ales, and gueuze are specifically produced for extended cellaring, often 3 to 10 or more years, with flavor profiles that shift, mellow, and develop genuine complexity over time as controlled oxidation and esterification proceed. The best before date on most commercial beer refers to a flavor peak window for hop-forward styles where freshness is the actual product. IPAs and pale ales where hop aroma and fermentation brightness are primary selling points that genuinely do diminish over time. It is not a food safety date for any category of beer. Vintage barley wines from craft producers are actively traded, collected, and vertically tasted across years in the same manner as vintage wine, with flavor comparisons across productions treated as a serious and legitimate hobby practice. An aged imperial stout loses aggressive alcohol heat over years of cellaring and develops dried fruit, leather, vanilla, and chocolate fudge notes that are not present in the fresh version. A transformation rather than a degradation. Fresh is the unambiguous priority for IPAs, pale ales, and wheat beers. Aged is often objectively better for high ABV, dark, malt-forward, or wild fermented styles. The date on the can is a freshness guide for specific styles, not a countdown to danger for all of them. 40. The claim that modern gluten-free beer has completely closed the gap, that technological advances have made the substitution seamless, and that you can't tell the difference anymore, is doing more work for the gluten-free brewing industry than the current product range uniformly deserves. Traditional beer is brewed from barley malt, which contains gluten proteins that contribute significantly to body, foam stability, and specific flavor compounds, including melanoidins, which contribute to color and rich flavor depth, and beta-glucans, which contribute to mouthfeel. True gluten-free beers brewed from alternative grains, most commonly sorghum, but also millet, rice, buckwheat, and corn, use raw materials that produce different flavor profiles. Sorghum in particular often generates a tart, slightly metallic character that experienced drinkers identify readily in blind evaluation. Gluten-reduced beers, which are made from barley, but treated with enzymes to cleave gluten proteins below the 20 parts per million regulatory threshold, are more flavor accurate than alternative grain versions, but technically retain gluten fragments, making them unsuitable for celiac patients under most current medical guidance despite their label positioning. Foam stability presents a persistent challenge because barley proteins contribute substantially to head retention, and alternative grain beers frequently require additional stabilizing additives to compensate for their absence. Quality within the gluten-free category has improved substantially and meaningfully over the last decade. Some millet-based products from specialist craft producers achieve credible and genuinely enjoyable results. The category average remains distinguishable from barley equivalents to experienced evaluators. The gap has narrowed considerably. Claiming it is closed is giving the process more credit than its most honest practitioners would honestly accept. 41. The creative drunk is a compelling mythology. A beer or two loosens the internal critic, removes self-censorship, and produces genuine creative breakthroughs that the sober mind would have blocked. Science has actually looked at a version of this, and the results are more specific, more limited, and more cautionary than the mythology implies. A 2012 study published in Consciousness and Cognition found that participants with a blood alcohol content of approximately 0.075 mild intoxication performed better on compound remote associates tasks, which measure insight-based problem-solving involving unusual connections between concepts. The headline finding was that mild intoxication may slightly improve certain types of creative association. The proposed mechanism is a reduction in working memory capacity that sounds counterintuitive, but may decrease the self-monitoring that filters unconventional or unexpected associations before they surface. This effect is extremely dose-dependent and disappears rapidly with increasing intoxication. Performance on tasks requiring focused analytical thinking, sustained attention, executive function, and iterative refinement, all components of actually developing and executing a creative idea, declines with even mild intoxication. Creativity is not a single cognitive process, and the divergent thinking component that alcohol may briefly assist represents only one part of what creative work actually requires. The confirmation bias around beer and creativity is also substantial. Creative people who drink remember the sessions where inspiration and alcohol coincided and forget the majority where alcohol produced nothing useful or actively degraded the work. Beer may briefly lower the fence between your safe thoughts and your interesting ones. What it cannot do is help you build anything on the other side of that fence with the precision the idea deserved. The inspiration is beer's brief gift. The execution has always been entirely yours. 42. Beer looks like a plant-based product at every stage of the description: grain, water, hops, yeast, and the assumption that it is therefore automatically vegan requires no investigation, no label reading, no uncomfortable discoveries. The assumption is wrong in ways that are specific, documented, and actively concealed by labeling conventions that were designed around ingredient disclosure rather than processing agent disclosure. Isinglass is a fining agent made from dried fish swim bladders, widely used in the brewing industry and particularly prevalent in British cask ale production, where it is added after fermentation to clarify the beer by attracting yeast and protein particles that then settle out of suspension. It is not required to appear on ingredient lists in most jurisdictions because it is technically a processing aid removed with the sediment rather than a retained ingredient. But contact between the isinglass and the beer occurs throughout the clarification process. Gelatin, derived from animal collagen, is similarly used as a fining agent in both commercial and homebrew applications. Lactose, derived from milk, is a genuine and retained ingredient in milk stouts and the majority of milkshake IPAs, products that are not vegan by ingredient rather than by processing, and where the label typically does disclose this. Honey appears as a fermentable adjunct in braggots and honey ales, again as a declared ingredient. Carmine, a red dye derived from cochineal insects, has appeared in some commercially produced fruit-flavored beer products. The Resource Barnivore maintains a publicly searchable database of beer products that have disclosed their fining and ingredient practices for exactly this reason. Beer looks like a plant-based product until you find out what has been swimming through it on its way to clarity. 43. Brand reputation in beer functions as a quality proxy. A shortcut that says if the brewery is famous, if the label is on the recommended list, if the name won awards within memory, then the current product in your hand reflects those credentials. This works considerably better as a social signal than as a beer quality evaluation tool. A brewery that produced exceptional IPAs 3 years ago may have scaled its production volume, changed key personnel including head brewers, modified ingredient sourcing, altered fermentation processes, or experienced quality control drift across any number of parameters, all without changing their branding in any visible way or without losing their historical awards from a period that no longer reflects current output. The most critical variable for fresh, hop-forward beer quality is the packaging date, and many retail environments do not rotate stock by production date or store beer in conditions cold, dark, correctly oriented that protect against the time, light, and oxygen exposure that degrade the product. A beer from a renowned brewery that has been on a warm, fluorescently lit retail shelf for 6 months may be objectively inferior to a less celebrated brewery's product canned and sold last week. Born on or packaged on dating, printing the actual production date rather than only a best before date, allows direct evaluation of freshness, and many producers resist this transparency for understandable commercial reasons. Rating aggregators reflect scores accumulated over time across varying product conditions and may include evaluations of fresh product that no longer represents what the brewery is currently producing. Ownership changes and contract brewing arrangements can alter production quality without public announcement, while brand equity from a previous era remains intact. Reputation tells you what was possible once. The packaging date tells you what's actually in the can. 44. The most comfortable lie in beer culture is that you have finished learning what you like. That you are a lager person, or a stout person, or an IPA person, and that any deviation from the established preference is a waste of time and money that a more experienced version of you has already accounted for. Sensory science demonstrates that palate adaptation is a real and continuous process with a documented physiological basis. Flavors that initially register as unpleasant, hop bitterness, the sharp sourness of a lambic, the intense roasted character of a very dark ale, become progressively more approachable with repeated exposure as the brain recalibrates its baseline response to those specific compounds. Bitter taste receptors are particularly sensitive to novelty and habituate meaningfully with exposure, which is why most beer enthusiasts can recall a specific period when they disliked styles they now actively seek out and prefer. Beer preference is also strongly context-dependent in ways that go beyond personal taste. Environment, ambient temperature, social context, and food pairing all measurably alter the experience of the same beverage in ways that laboratory and real-world research on beverage perception consistently confirm. The range of styles available across the full spectrum of what beer encompasses, from sub-3% session lagers to 18% barrel-aged stouts, from bone-dry brute IPAs to dessert-adjacent pastry stouts, from wine-like goose to savory smoked Rauchbier, is so broad that declaring a fixed preference forecloses enormous territory based on a sample that remains definitionally incomplete. The world's most respected beer writers and judges describe ongoing, active development of preference throughout careers measured in decades, not a settled position arrived at early and defended thereafter. Deciding you've finished learning what you like is telling your palate it's done working before it's halfway through the catalog. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.